Sarah sat in the old armchair, a cup of hot tea resting in her hands. In the quiet space of the room, the dim light cast a soft glow across her face, her delicate skin marked by the passage of time. She closed her eyes and listened to the gentle sounds coming from the television. A second later, the door opened. Kevin walked in without a greeting, without even a glance at her, offering only a hurried and cold command. "Get out of the room, old woman." Sarah said nothing. Her hands tightened around the teacup, the heat seeping into her body as if awakening a hidden strength. Kevin's words were like a slap without form, striking hard at her dignity. Yet she simply rose and walked to her room without arguing, without a word of protest. She had lived long enough to understand that not every insult required a response. Kevin remained standing there, watching her figure disappear. He did not realize that his words had ignited a fire within her, one that had long been smothered. Sarah was no longer the weak, patient woman who sacrificed everything for her family. For too long, she had lived in the shadows, afraid to speak, afraid to resist. But as the bedroom door closed, a decision formed clearly in her mind. She would no longer stand behind others, caring and sacrificing while losing herself. The door shut softly. Sarah paused in the middle of the small room and looked at her reflection in the mirror. The face staring back at her was no longer that of a gentle, resigned, elderly woman. It was the face of someone who had once held power, who had built a family and a home. She was not an old woman in her son-in-law's eyes. She was the owner of everything they believed belonged to them. Sarah walked to the bed and opened the drawer in the cabinet. Old papers, contracts, the certificate of ownership for this house, all neatly arranged as a reminder of the authority she once possessed. These papers were not lifeless sheets. They were symbols of freedom and control, and now they would help her reclaim the life that had slipped through her fingers for so many years. She picked up her phone, her hand trembling not with fear, but with the surge of power that comes from making a decision. She scrolled through her contacts and called Daniel Richards, the attorney she had worked with in the past. After a moment, his voice answered on the other end, asking what was wrong, his tone deep and urgent. Sarah spoke calmly yet firmly, telling him she needed his help and that she wanted Kevin and Emily to move out of the house because they no longer had the right to stay there. A long silence followed her words. She knew Daniel was surprised, but she did not care. She was no longer the gentle woman who endured in silence. She had decided to reclaim her authority in her own home. When she ended the call, an unusual sense of peace washed over her. She no longer worried about curses or contemptuous looks from those around her. She had made her decision. No one would belittle her again. No one would treat her as useless or as a burden in the family. She was the owner of this house. She was the one who had spent her entire life building it and nurturing it. And now she would take everything back. Sarah looked out the window. Night had fallen and clouds drifted heavily across the sky. A faint light from outside filtered into the room and reflected on her face. She smiled, not out of happiness, but out of freedom, the feeling that she had found herself again. Stepping into the bathroom, she looked into the mirror once more. She saw herself, but not as a weak woman. She saw a powerful woman, someone who knew how to stand up for herself. In that moment, Sarah Evans was no longer an old woman in anyone's eyes. She was the owner of this house and the woman reclaiming her own life. Her story was only just beginning, and she would not allow anyone to stop her again. Sarah sat in the small room, a cold cup of tea in her hand, her eyes fixed on the window. The faint glow of the streetlight filtered inside, illuminating her hands, fingers no longer as agile as before, yet still filled with strength. She did not see Kevin or Emily anywhere. They had left the day before, after she sent the notice demanding that they move out of the house. Even so, there was a heaviness in her heart, not because of their departure, but because of the change within herself. The feeling was like a storm gathering quietly inside, ready to rise. She had once been so accustomed to sacrifice, to doing whatever others asked without hesitation. Now everything was different. That sense of power was no longer distant. It was present in every decision she made. The door to Attorney Daniel Richards' office opened, and Sarah stepped inside. She sat down across from him without speaking. Daniel looked at her with surprise, but his professionalism quickly returned. He said he understood how she felt, yet he wanted her to be prepared for whatever might happen next, because it would not be easy. Sarah looked at him, a faint smile touching her lips, not out of joy, but from fearlessness. She replied that nothing was ever easy, but she had lived long enough to know that change does not come gently. It comes with determination. She lifted her handbag from the table and took out documents, contracts, and copies of the house ownership papers. These were not merely legal documents. To her, they symbolized power and the freedom she had lost for too many years. They would prove that no one could take away what belonged to her. She asked calmly yet firmly what they would do next. Daniel looked at her, unable to hide his admiration for the resolve in her eyes, and said they would send an official notice, and if Kevin and Emily refused to leave, they would file a lawsuit. Sarah nodded and told him to proceed, explaining she could not continue living like this, that both she and her daughter deserved their own lives. A growing sense of relief filled her heart. She no longer felt exhausted by cold words or ignored by those she had cared for over the years. The change within her was profound, not only physical, but deeply emotional. She was no longer the woman standing quietly behind her family. She was a woman in control of her own life. Leaving the lawyer's office, she felt lighter than ever. Each step she took seemed to affirm the power and freedom she had reclaimed. As she stepped outside, she paused and breathed in the fresh morning air, sensing a peace she had not known in years. It felt as though life was returning to her piece by piece. Yet life was not so simple. The very next morning, as Sarah prepared breakfast, the doorbell rang. She opened the door and saw Emily standing there, her daughter's eyes filled with worry. Emily pleaded with her not to go through with it, admitting that Kevin had been wrong, but insisting that she could not throw them out like this. Sarah said nothing at first, only looked at her daughter. A wave of sorrow rose within her. Emily, the child she had devoted her entire life to, was now standing before her, begging her to reconsider. Sarah felt as though she stood between two choices. One was sacrifice, continuing to live in a family without respect. The other was freedom, the control over her own life she had lacked for so many years. She told Emily gently but firmly that her daughter could not understand, that she had lived too long for others and could not continue that way. Emily lowered her head, tears falling silently. Sarah felt her daughter's pain, yet she knew she had to do what was right. It was a decision that could not be changed, no matter how painful. After Emily left, a strange emptiness filled the house. Sarah returned to her room and sat down in her armchair. For the first time in many years, she no longer felt like a woman sacrificing herself unconditionally. She felt like a woman with power, a woman with the right to decide her own life. In that moment, she knew her life had turned a new page. The years of silent endurance were behind her. She had endured long enough, and now she could finally stand up and live for herself. Sarah stood at the bedroom door, legal documents in her hand, a heavy feeling pressing against her chest. The spacious house still held the memories of a family she had devoted herself to building for so many years. Yet those memories no longer lingered within her the way they once had. The paintings hanging on the walls, the old armchair she loved, everything had become lifeless objects, no longer carrying the warmth of the family devotion she had once given so completely. Everything had changed, not because of the house itself, but because of the people inside it. Her footsteps echoed steadily across the wooden floor as she walked into the kitchen, the place where she used to prepare breakfast for her children. The rich scent of coffee still lingered in the air, but it no longer brought the comfort it once did. A sense of emptiness filled the space, leaving her feeling hollow. Even so, she did not feel afraid, nor did she feel crushed by loneliness. Instead, she felt a quiet calm, as if she were finally touching the freedom she had lost long ago. She reached for her phone, opened her contacts, and called Daniel Richards. This time, there was no hesitation, her sense of determination stronger than ever. When he answered, she spoke briefly and firmly, telling him she wanted to begin the legal proceedings, that she could not allow them to continue staying there, that she had endured enough. On the other end, Daniel was silent for a moment before asking if she was truly prepared for what was coming next, reminding her that this would not only affect Kevin and Emily, but the entire family. Sarah took a deep breath, feeling each of his words like sharp blades cutting into her heart. She knew the decision would not be easy, but there was no turning back. She told him she was ready, that this was the moment, that she could no longer live in the shadow of silent endurance. After the call ended, Sarah sat down once more in her familiar armchair. She looked around, sensing the change within herself. The house was the same, but she was no longer the small woman who waited for love and respect from others. She was the one who held the power, the one who decided her own life, and today she was determined to protect it. That strength had not come easily. Just the day before, when she decided to ask Kevin and Emily to move out, her heart had ached, but today she no longer felt that same pain. She felt stronger than ever. Living for herself was something she had waited for all these years. The next day, Sarah decided to walk through the house she had lived in for so long, the home she had built and cared for down to every detail. Yet when she stepped inside, the first feeling she noticed was not the familiar warmth. Everything was quiet, still, as if the house itself were waiting for something. She walked into the living room, once filled with laughter and family noise, but now only silence remained. The armchairs, the paintings on the walls, all stood like witnesses to the past, yet they no longer tied her to her family. She moved closer to the television, once the center of the household, where evenings were spent together watching films and talking. A flicker of sorrow passed through her heart, but she pushed it away. She had spent too long living for others, too long accepting disrespect and unkind words. She could not continue that way. Sarah returned to her room, an open drawer where she kept important papers. The ownership documents, the contracts, the records she had preserved for years. A sense of power returned to her hands, a feeling she had lost during the long years of being a mother and a wife. She held the papers tightly as if they were proof of her independence and freedom. She was no longer the one who lost, no longer dependent on anyone. Then a familiar voice spoke from behind her, asking her not to do this. Sarah did not turn around, but she knew it was Emily standing there, her daughter, the child she had raised and loved and protected for so many years. But Emily was no longer a little girl who could be shielded forever. She had grown and needed to face life on her own. Emily asked whether they could resolve everything without going this far, her voice filled with worry. Sarah turned and looked at her daughter. There was no softness in her eyes now, no gentle kindness as before. She looked at Emily, not as a mother seeking to protect her child, but as a woman with power, a woman capable of deciding her own destiny. She told Emily that she could not continue living in deception, that she could not continue nurturing disrespect, that she loved her, but she could no longer sacrifice herself for things that were unworthy. Her voice was calm but firm. Emily lowered her head and said nothing more. Sarah knew she understood. And though it was painful, Sarah also knew her decision was right. She had lived for others far too long. Now it was time to live for herself. Sarah stood by the window, looking outside as the first rays of morning sunlight streamed through the glass. A gentle breeze carried fallen leaves from the tree in the yard into the air, like a greeting from change itself. In the quiet space of the house, she felt as though she had just returned to herself. That sense of strength, though touched with a hint of emptiness, brought her an indescribable peace. Each step she took inside this house was no longer uncertain, no longer an effort to search for sympathy, but a declaration of power from a woman who had risen after years of living in the shadow of silent endurance. Sarah turned back to her desk, where she kept all the important documents related to her home and property. Those old papers now felt like solid evidence in her hands. They were not merely memories of the past, but tools for rebuilding her life from the very foundation she had created. She was no longer the fragile woman oppressed by the words and actions of others. Since yesterday, after her conversation with Daniel Richards, her attorney, everything had begun to change. She had decided not to allow those who took advantage of her to remain in her life. She had asked Daniel to send an official notice requiring Kevin and Emily to move out within 30 days. Yet she knew this decision would not be easy. When she chose to face the truth, to face the doubtful looks and words from her daughter and son-in-law, she understood she would have to pay a price for her resolve. Things would not unfold as gently as she might hope. But she also realized that if she did not act, she would never reclaim her own life. She remembered her conversation with Emily the night before. Her daughter had come to see her, eyes filled with sadness, yet still carrying the longing to be protected by her mother. Emily could not understand why she had to do this. She had pleaded with her not to go through with it, her voice trembling with worry and confusion. Sarah had looked into her daughter's eyes without hesitation. She had lived for others for too long. It was time to live for herself. She had told Emily she could not continue nurturing this deception, that she loved her, but she could not keep living in the shadow of irresponsible words. Her voice had not trembled. It carried only determination. After that conversation, Sarah felt as though she had been released. One door had closed, but another had opened, a door to freedom, to authority within the very home she had worked so hard to build, to the right to decide everything in her own life. The next day, when Sarah stepped into Daniel Richards' office, she knew this was a turning point from which there was no return. All she needed now was firmness and perseverance. No more fear, no more hesitation. Everything was in her hands. Daniel handed her the documents related to the lawsuit proceedings, papers she once would have signed without fully understanding their meaning. Now holding them, she felt as if she were holding the world itself. He told her he had prepared everything and they would proceed that very day, his voice professional yet tinged with concern. Sarah nodded, a faint smile forming on her lips, and told him to go ahead because she had made her decision and there was no reason to delay. In that moment, she realized that even if she had to face resistance or judgment from her loved ones, she would not step back. The years of sacrifice for her family and her children were over. She could not continue living in numbness, being belittled and disrespected. She was a woman who had once led a company, a woman who had helped many people overcome hardship. She could not allow a son-in-law who disrespected her to continue controlling her life. The sense of power surged within her again as she looked at the signed papers. They were no longer just contracts or legal documents. They were weapons, tools to reclaim the life she desired. She was the sole owner of this house, and she would not allow anyone to take that away. On her way home, Sarah looked around, but this time she felt no anxiety or unease. Instead, she sensed a strange freedom, like someone who had broken free from the grip of the past and was ready to step into a new future. When the front door closed behind her, it was not merely a return to the house, it was a return to herself and to control over her own life. As she stepped inside, everything looked the same, yet she knew the house now truly belonged to her, no longer a place influenced by others. She could live in this quiet, live for herself and no one else. And in that moment, Sarah felt at peace. Sarah stood in the living room, the light from the table lamp casting a glow across her face and highlighting the wrinkles carved by time. Her long, slender fingers gripped the sheet of paper tightly. It was the document signed yesterday at the office of Daniel Richards. It was not merely a legal paper, but proof of a life-changing decision, a decision not to return to the past and not to continue living in compromise. She placed the paper down on the table and looked out the window. The sky outside had turned a deep shade of gray, as if time itself were reflecting the emotions within her. The anxiety that once lingered in her was no longer there. Though a slight restlessness surfaced when she thought about her meeting with Emily that morning, she knew she had done the right thing. Emily had arrived early, standing at the door like a lost child. Her skin was pale, her eyes uncertain, her voice fragile, as she said she did not understand why her mother was doing this, and that she could not simply force them to leave. Those words struck Sarah's heart and tightened her chest. How could she allow her daughter to suffer like that? Yet when she looked into Emily's fearful eyes, she knew that if she did not act, her daughter would remain trapped forever. Sarah had replied gently but firmly that she could not continue nurturing deception, and that she had lived too long for others. Now it was time to live for herself. She turned and walked across the living room, a space she had been attached to for so many years, where every brick and every painting carried memories. Yet now everything was different. Everything in this house belonged to her. No one had the right to dictate her life. No one could treat her as excess in her own home. Despite Kevin's complaints and Emily's reproachful looks, Sarah remained steadfast. Today was a turning point. She could not continue living in a family without mutual respect. She could not remain the shadow of others. As she looked around the house, she felt a freedom she had never known before. Still, the decision was not easy. She remembered raising Emily, the late nights waking to care for her when she was sick, the quiet hours in the kitchen preparing meals for the family. The instinct of a mother, even when painful, was always to sacrifice. Those memories could not be erased, yet today they had to give way to an undeniable truth. The feeling was like a blade piercing her heart, yet at the same time, it was an irreversible liberation. She could not go on living as an invisible presence within her own family. She needed to stand up and love herself. She walked to her desk, where she had once written countless documents, signed important contracts, and approved decisions that changed many lives. This time she was not signing for business, she was signing for her own life. She spoke into the stillness of the room, telling Daniel it was time and to send the eviction request that very day because she no longer had time to hesitate. Over the phone, his voice no longer carried surprise as it once had, but respect and understanding as he assured her everything would be sent and resolved. A wave of relief rose within her. No one could control her anymore. No one could make her feel small in her own home. For the first time in many years, Sarah truly felt in control of her life. She was no longer an afterthought in her family. She was not an old woman, dismissed and disrespected. She was a decisive and strong woman with the right to live unbound. When she glanced at the old television in the living room, once the center of family gatherings, she did not feel loneliness. The beautiful memories no longer dominated her. The house had become a place where she could take ownership of her life and begin again. As she walked toward the front door, she no longer felt fear at the sound of the phone ringing. It was a call from Emily. Yet this time, there was no anxiety in her heart. Her beloved daughter had begun to understand what she had tried to teach her. Emily was no longer a child needing protection forever. She had grown and now understood the meaning of independence. Over the phone, Emily said she understood, her voice softer now, no longer angry, only filled with acceptance. Sarah smiled and felt warmth spread through her heart. At last, she had done the right thing. She was no longer an extra presence in her family. Sarah Evans had reclaimed her power, and now she no longer needed to live in the shadow of sacrifice. Sarah stood in the living room, holding the remote control, her eyes fixed on the television screen, playing a program she barely cared about. All she could truly feel in that moment was emptiness, a strange sensation as she realized this house no longer held the warmth of a close-knit family. It was no longer the home of her little daughter or of her late husband. It was her house now, a place where she could control everything, from the biggest decisions to the smallest details. Yesterday, she had met Daniel Richards once again and signed the necessary legal documents requiring Kevin and Emily to leave within 30 days. It had felt inevitable, a decision rising from the deepest part of her heart. Yet today, she did not feel joy or triumph. Instead, there was a peculiar loneliness, as if some fragment of memory had slipped away in the process. She walked to the window and looked outside, at a view she had seen countless times over the years. The trees in the garden still stood firm, the doors remained closed, everything appeared unchanged, yet she was the one who had altered it all. The people around her would never see her the same way again. They would no longer think of her as the fragile woman willing to endure everything without resistance. No, Sarah had changed, and she felt it deeply within her. The doorbell rang, pulling her back to the present. She was not surprised. She knew who stood on the other side. When she opened the door, Emily was there, looking tired, yet her eyes were different. They no longer carried accusation or anger as before. This time, there was only silence between mother and daughter. Emily spoke softly, saying she had reconsidered and was sorry for not understanding, that she knew her mother only wanted what was best for the family. Sarah looked at her daughter and felt her heart soften at the change she saw. She remembered raising her, the sleepless nights caring for her when she was ill. Now, Emily had grown and understood that life was not always about affection and sacrifice. Sarah knew her daughter could not continue living in someone else's shadow. She replied in a low voice, slightly thick with emotion, that she was not heartless. She simply did not want her daughter to keep living in deception and silent endurance, that she loved her but could not continue living that way. Emily lowered her head, a small spark of hope brightening her eyes. She realized her mother was not weak as she once believed. Sarah was a strong woman who had chosen to rebuild her life, and Emily too would have to do the same. She said she would look for a new job, that she did not want to be a burden, and would take care of herself. Sarah smiled gently, filled with pride. Her daughter had grown up. She no longer needed to protect her forever. Emily could stand on her own, and Sarah felt she had fulfilled her role as a mother, a realization that brought her deep peace. But that peace did not last long. Another knock sounded, this time from Kevin, the son-in-law she had decided would no longer remain in her home. He stood at the door with an irritated expression, anger in his eyes, saying he had heard about her decision and that it was not the right way to resolve things. Sarah did not answer immediately. She simply looked at him without yielding. He was no longer the man she once welcomed as a son, no longer someone she hoped to embrace as family. He was a man who had taken advantage and shown no respect, and he no longer had the right to stand inside this house. She told him calmly but with authority that she had made her decision, that it was her house, and she did not want anyone to stay if they could not respect her, and if he could not accept that, he could leave immediately. Kevin stood there, stunned by her firmness. He had not expected such strength from her. A flicker of fear appeared in his eyes before he turned and walked away without another word. Sarah remained still, a sense of power filling her heart. Nothing could shake her now. She had taken control of her life, and she felt satisfied. Looking out the window once more, she knew she was no longer the one who had lost in her own home. She had won, not through argument or bitterness, but by firmly reclaiming her power. In that moment, she no longer felt alone. She had found herself again. Sarah sat in the armchair, holding a cup of cold tea, her eyes resting on the candles flickering softly in the room. The dim yellow lights cast a faint glow across her face. Although it was still bright outside, a deep sense of calm had begun to settle within her. There was relief after the decisions she had made, after the tense confrontations, yet she knew her battle was not completely over. This house, where she had lived for so many years, now carried a different meaning. It was no longer a home of compromise and blind sacrifice. It was a home of power and of the freedom she had reclaimed. She recalled the tense encounter with Kevin the day before. He had stood at the door with anger written across his face, his eyes filled with resentment and refusal to accept her decision. He had tried to persuade her to change her mind, insisting it was a hasty act made without thought. In that moment, Sarah had simply looked at him in silence. Words were unnecessary because she already knew what she had to do. There was no need for reasons or explanations. She had decided, and with that determination, she had sent him away. When the door closed behind him, she felt no regret or anxiety. Relief filled her heart as his presence disappeared from the house, leaving only the gentle sound of wind against the window and soft background music from the television. She smiled, a smile she had never worn before. For the first time in many long years, she felt power in her own hands. That peace was soon interrupted by the sound of the doorbell. Sarah rose, her hand trembling slightly, not from fear, but from anticipation. She knew who it would be. Emily had come again. Though her daughter was grown, Sarah sensed there was still something unfinished between them. Emily was still her child, yet Sarah was no longer the mother who could only worry and protect her forever. When Emily stepped inside, her eyes no longer carried anger or outrage. She looked thoughtful, worried, yet there was also a trace of hope. She spoke softly, saying she had thought about what her mother had said and understood, but asked whether her mother truly wanted to sever their relationship because she could not live without her. Sarah looked at her daughter without weakness or doubt. For years, she had lived for family and for others, but she had come to understand that only by living for herself could she truly offer value to anyone else. She smiled gently, and this time there was no uncertainty in it. She told Emily she did not need to fear losing their relationship, that she loved her, but loving her did not mean sacrificing everything or living in silent endurance, that she had lived for others too long, and now it was time to live for herself. Emily stood still, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. Yet Sarah did not look at her with pity. She saw her daughter as a strong woman who understood the value of standing up for herself. She told her she had done well, that she had found herself again, and that all she could do now was encourage her to live independently and take care of herself. Emily lowered her head, but there was no weakness left in her posture. She had grown and understood that love was not blind endurance, but respect and freedom. She looked up at her mother with a small smile and promised she would take care of herself, that she would do everything she could not to be a burden anymore, that she knew her mother had done what was best for the family. Sarah said nothing more, yet peace once again filled her heart. She could feel her daughter's growth and realized their relationship was no longer one of dependence, but of connection between two independent women. She had given her daughter freedom, and that was what mattered most. After Emily left, Sarah returned to the living room and looked at the paintings on the walls, the objects that once symbolized a happy family. Now they no longer carried sorrow. They were signs of a life that had passed and of a woman who had rediscovered herself. She no longer felt fear or doubt. She had taken control of everything. The sense of freedom within her was like a powerful wind, sweeping away the anxiety and fear she had carried for years. This house was no longer a place ruled by others' decisions. It was the home of Sarah Evans, and now she would live in it on her own terms, without compromise or sacrifice for anyone else. She sat back down in the chair, holding the remote, and this time there was no need to rush. She turned up the volume, letting the sound echo through the quiet space, like a declaration that she had finally found herself. Sarah stood by the window, her eyes fixed on the garden outside. The sky had shifted from a heavy gray to the pale gold of late afternoon, and leaves drifted gently to the ground, carried by the wind like a quiet reminder of time's relentless cycle. A strange feeling settled over her, both peaceful and restless at once. Her hands rested against the window frame, her palms damp with a tension she could not quite shake. The changes in her life, though decided long ago, still left her with a lingering sense of something unfinished. This house, once the place where she had witnessed every joy and sorrow of her family, was no longer a home of unconditional sacrifice. It was now a house of freedom, of authority, of decisions that could not be undone. The door opened suddenly, and Daniel Richards stepped inside, his expression serious yet filled with understanding. Sarah felt the silence in the room, as if everything was waiting for a final conclusion. "Sarah, the notice has been sent. Kevin and Emily will have to move out within 30 days. The decision is final," Daniel said, his voice low but gentle. "They will react, of course, but we have done the right thing." Sarah looked at the documents on the table, papers that represented not only a legal transfer of power, but also her claim to control over her own life. A profound change was unfolding, and she knew she was the one making every decision. No one could alter that. No one could threaten the freedom she had reclaimed. Even though everything had been carefully planned and set in motion, she still felt an unfamiliar emptiness. This house, the home she had devoted her entire life to building, no longer held the warmth of family. The people she had once loved and protected were no longer part of this life. It was a truth she had to accept. The doorbell rang again, but this time Sarah felt neither anxiety nor surprise. The door opened and Emily stepped inside, her expression different now. There was no resentment in her eyes, no confusion or defiance, only silence and a deep understanding. "Mom, I have been thinking," Emily said softly, her voice no longer fragile. "I was wrong to believe you did not love me. You only wanted what was best for this family. I understand now. You cannot live for people who do not appreciate you." Sarah stood still, looking at her daughter. Emily's eyes no longer held disappointment or unspoken questions, but acceptance, the maturity Sarah had always hoped to see. All the years she had devoted to Emily, everything she had done, had finally borne fruit. Her daughter had realized that living an independent life was not selfish, but necessary for growth. Mom, I do not want to go on like before. I will find a job. I will take care of myself. I will not be your burden anymore. Emily lifted her gaze, her eyes filled with determination. I will stand on my own. Sarah smiled gently, the smile of a mother truly proud of her child. After everything that had happened, Emily finally understood that love was not indulgence or silent endurance, but respect and the freedom for each person to grow. That was what Sarah had always wanted her to see, and now she had. You have done very well, Emily, Sarah said, her voice low and warm. This is what I wanted you to understand long ago. I do not want to hold you back. I want you to grow, to be strong, to take care of yourself. You have done that, and I am very proud of you. Emily said nothing, only lowered her head, but the smile on her lips said everything. She had found herself again, and so had her mother. For the first time in many years, a sense of peace filled Sarah completely. She had done everything for her family, but now she knew she needed to live for herself. This house was no longer a place that buried sacrifices left unappreciated, but a place to begin again. She was no longer the overlooked presence in her own family, no longer someone dependent on others. She was the one in control of her life. Sarah returned to her desk and looked at the papers she had signed. They were not merely legal documents, but declarations of the authority and freedom she had regained. Each signature marked a powerful step forward, not only legally, but within her own mind. She had won, and no one could take that victory from her. As the last light of day slowly faded, Sarah sat down in her armchair, for the first time not feeling alone. In the stillness, she heard the wind brushing against the window and the soft music playing from the television. Everything around her moved forward, yet she knew that now she truly held control over her life, and nothing could shake that resolve. Sarah sat in the living room, her eyes fixed on the television as it played faint, flickering images she barely cared about. Everything around her seemed to have lost the meaning it once held. This house, a space filled with memories, had changed. It was no longer a place echoing with family laughter, but a space of emptiness and quiet, and yet also of the power she had reclaimed. Every step she took within these walls now gave her the feeling of being an independent woman, self-possessed and no longer dependent on anyone. For the first time in many years, Sarah felt no guilt and no need to explain her decisions to anyone. The choices she had made were not acts of selfishness, but choices for her own life, for the self-respect she deserved. In that moment, she felt more clearly than ever that no one had the right to control her life anymore. Yesterday, after Emily decided to leave and begin a new life, a sense of peace had settled over her. It was a transformation, not only in living arrangements, but in the way she saw herself and chose to live. No longer the mother who endlessly worried and sacrificed, Sarah was now a free woman, entitled to choose her own path without being influenced by anyone else. However, just as she began to believe everything had finally settled, the doorbell rang again. Sarah did not flinch. She knew who was standing behind the door. It was Kevin, her son-in-law, the man she had sent away the day before, the man who had made her endure years of disrespect. Now he had returned, this time with a different demeanor. Sarah rose and walked toward the door with steady confidence. When she opened it, Kevin stood there, looking exhausted, dark circles under his eyes from lack of sleep. He did not greet her as he once had. He simply stood there, his gaze shifting uneasily. Sarah, he began, his voice no longer cold or arrogant as before. I need to talk. I know I was wrong, and I want to fix everything. Sarah looked at him without responding immediately. She showed no confusion or surprise. Instead, she felt a faint sense of irony. The weakness he displayed now made her realize something clearly. He no longer had the power to control her. The days when he lived under this roof, believing he could command and dictate her life, were over. He says he wants to fix everything, Sarah thought to herself, but it is too late to change. She took a deep breath and replied in a calm yet firm voice, Kevin, I do not know what you expect by coming back here, But I do not need your apologies. I do not need you to fix anything. You and I no longer have any relationship." Her tone was low and resolute, without the slightest hesitation. Kevin looked at her, disappointment clouding his eyes, as if he could not believe the transformation before him. He had grown accustomed to her being gentle, always ready to forgive. But what he saw now was not a weak woman. It was a resilient warrior, a strong and decisive mother with no room left for endless forgiveness. "But Emily's mother, we can start over together, can't we?" Kevin said. Yet his confidence was gone, replaced by doubt and confusion. Sarah allowed herself a faint smile, not mocking, but deeply aware. "You had your chance. You and Emily had too many chances, and you wasted them all. You did not respect me, and now I will not allow you to continue destroying my life." Kevin stood silent, as though her words had extinguished every remaining hope within him. Perhaps a part of him understood that Sarah was no longer someone he could manipulate, but a steady woman who had reclaimed her strength and authority. Sarah remained there, looking at him with unwavering resolve. Silence filled the space, broken only by the wind outside and the muted sound of the television from the living room. She knew this feeling was not victory, but liberation. Not a triumphant conquest, but a powerful step forward without retreat. At last, Kevin turned away without another word. His footsteps were soft, as though the weight of failure pressed permanently upon his shoulders. Sarah did not watch him leave, nor did she feel any regret. She simply returned to the living room, sat down in her armchair, and allowed the silence to surround her. She knew that after everything, she had done the right thing. Change was never easy, but it was necessary. And now, Sarah was a free woman. She was no longer someone standing behind the decisions of others. She was the one deciding her own life, the one in control of her own destiny. Looking out the window, Sarah felt at peace. This house, though changed, was still her home, and she knew it was the place where she would begin again. Sarah stood by the window, looking out at the quiet streets of the morning. The hazy sunlight filtered through the glass, reflecting softly onto the old family portrait hanging on the wall. A feeling both familiar and distant intertwined within her. Everything in this house had changed, not only on the surface, but within her as well. A woman who had spent her entire life in the shadows of sacrifice and endurance had now become the master of her own life, of her own home, and no one could take that away from her. The encounter with Kevin yesterday still echoed in her mind. After she asked him to leave, there were no more harsh words, no hurried apologies. He had fallen silent and quietly walked out the door without daring to look back. Perhaps he had finally realized that Sarah was no longer the woman willing to forgive his actions, no longer a weak mother he could manipulate. Both Kevin and Emily now understood that Sarah's life was no longer bound to unconditional sacrifice. But with Emily, the story had not fully ended. Although she had grown up and understood that her mother was no longer someone she could rely on forever, Sarah's words had still left her unsettled, not because of their firmness, but because of the immense change she was not yet fully ready to accept. Sarah understood that. She did not want to hurt her daughter, but the truth was that Emily needed to learn how to live independently. That was the lesson she had spent her entire life trying to teach her. The door opened, and Emily stepped inside. This time, there was no anger or irritation in her eyes. Instead, there was caution and expectation. She looked at her mother differently, as though searching for empathy and acceptance from the woman who had guided her for so many years. "Mom, I have thought a lot about what you said," Emily began, her voice gentle and no longer interrupted as before. "I cannot keep living dependent on you like this. I want to change. I will take care of myself." Sarah looked into her daughter's eyes and felt the change in her voice. It was no longer hesitation, but determination. She smiled softly, and in that smile she saw not only her daughter's growth, but also herself. The decisions she had made had not only transformed her own life, but had also become a powerful lesson for her daughter about standing firm, living independently, and loving oneself. "That is what I wanted to hear from you, Emily," Sarah said, her voice lowering like a blessing. "I am very proud of you. You are grown now, and it is time for you to walk your own path." Emily stood still, her gaze softened, free of the exhaustion and worry it once carried. She was no longer a little girl seeking protection from her mother. She had matured and understood that life was not always about being shielded, but sometimes about independence and the courage to face difficulties. In that moment, Sarah realized she had fulfilled her mission. She had done well as a mother, not by protecting her daughter forever, but by teaching her how to stand strong and live true to herself. Emily said nothing more, only lowered her head slightly before stepping out the door, leaving Sarah standing there, sensing the shift in the air around her. She no longer felt emptiness or loneliness as before. Instead, she felt a deep satisfaction, as though everything had finally fallen into its rightful place. This house was not merely a container of memories, but a place of transformation, of growth, and of the authority she had reclaimed. Sarah turned her gaze back to the television, where she and her family once gathered, but now it was only an object. Everything had changed. She was no longer a mother or wife defined solely by sacrifice, but an independent and strong woman with the right to decide every aspect of her own life. Most importantly, she no longer had to live in the shadow of the past. This feeling, this freedom, was not a sense of victory, but of peace and acceptance. Sarah understood that every decision she made came with a price, but it was a price she was willing to pay to find herself again. No more worries about others, no more unconditional sacrifice. She was living for herself, and that was what she had always deserved. She sat down in her familiar armchair, a sense of power and freedom filling her heart. This house, no matter how much it had changed, was still her home, and now she would live in it her own way. Sarah sat quietly in the living room, the light from the table lamp falling across the papers on the desk. Everything in the house was silent, yet it was not a silence filled with loneliness or sorrow. Across from her stood the empty chairs, the old paintings still hanging on the walls, but they were no longer evidence of a once warm and happy family. Everything in the house had been rearranged, not only outwardly, but within Sarah's heart as well. Everything had returned to its rightful place. The house was no longer a space of unconditional sacrifice, but a place of authority and freedom she had reclaimed. She recalled the long years when her life revolved around sacrifice and endurance. She had lived in the shadows, pressured by loved ones, always worrying about others while forgetting herself. Arguments and criticism had cornered her into silence, leaving her afraid to speak. But now, with everything changed, Sarah realized that her silence had become a declaration of power. Silence did not mean weakness. It was how she controlled her life, how she showed her family she was no longer dependent. Looking at the phone on the table, she could not help thinking about the calls and messages from Emily over the past few days. Her daughter had tried to reconnect, hoping for another chance, a new beginning. But Sarah did not rush to respond. She had given Emily time to reflect, to choose her own path without relying on her mother. Those calls and messages were no longer a test, but signs of change that Sarah believed would eventually lead her daughter to understanding. The doorbell rang, and this time Sarah did not feel unsettled. She knew it was Emily, trying to find her way back after everything that had happened. Yet there was no confusion or anxiety within her. She knew that despite moments of weakness, Emily had begun to grow. The decisions Sarah had made had shaped not only her own life, but also her daughter's perspective. When the door opened, Emily stepped inside. The light seemed to highlight the changes in her face. She was no longer the lost and fragile girl she had been before. In her eyes now was determination and understanding Sarah had never seen. There was no blame left, only acceptance. "Mom, I have thought about everything," Emily began, her voice steadier than ever. "I understand you now. I am not a child anymore. I cannot live under your protection forever. I will take care of myself, just as you taught me." Sarah looked at her daughter and felt the transformation in her words. She was no longer a mother who needed to shield her child for life, but a mother who had taught her how to stand on her own feet. That was what she had always wanted. She smiled gently, and within that smile was satisfaction and immense pride. "That is what I wanted to hear from you." "Emily," Sarah said, her voice low and warm, "I am very proud of you. You truly understand that life is not endless protection but independence. I helped you reach this point, and you have grown." Emily sat down, her eyes bright as though she had discovered something essential about her life. She was no longer a child dependent on her mother. She was a woman capable of standing firm and choosing her own path. Sarah felt a weight lift from her heart. She no longer needed to protect her forever. It was time for Emily to care for herself, and that was what she had always hoped for. "Thank you, Mom," Emily said, her voice strong and certain. "I do not know what I would have done without you, but now I understand that you want me to live for myself. I will do that." Sarah rose, stepped closer, and embraced her daughter. This was not an embrace of protection, but of understanding and acceptance. She had completed her role. She had raised her daughter to stand independently, no longer living in her mother's shadow. "You did very well, Emily," Sarah said, her voice filled with love and pride. "You will continue on your path, and I will always be here, not to shield you, but to watch over you like a friend." Emily nodded and stood, ready to leave. There was no need to hold her back. Her daughter had learned life's most important lesson, to live independently and care for herself. As Emily stepped out the door, a strange peace filled Sarah's heart, a peace she had never known before, when every decision in her life was made freely, without attachment or dependence. Sarah returned to the living room and looked around at the house she had built over so many years. Everything appeared the same, yet she had changed. She was no longer living in the shadow of sacrifice, but standing firmly on her own feet, allowing no one to control her life again. This feeling, this freedom, was not an ending, but a new beginning. She sat down in her armchair, breathing slowly and calmly. She knew that although life would bring more challenges, she would never surrender her power again. This house was not only a shelter, but a place of freedom, where she would live life in her own way. Sarah's story is only just beginning, and her journey has taught us a valuable lesson. Never let anyone decide your life for you, no matter who they are. Always stand firm, live for yourself, and never stop fighting to reclaim the power that belongs in your own life. If you feel inspired by this story, do not forget to share your thoughts in the comments below this video. And be sure to like and subscribe so you do not miss the next stories about strong women filled with resilience and a deep desire for freedom. Let us share with you moments of inspiration and motivation every single day. Thank you for watching, and we will see you again in the next videos.